My name is Lindsay Fox, and I'm a third-year doctoral student here at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. And today I'm here with Professor Doug Staiger.
I'm Doug Staiger, and I'm at Dartmouth in the economics department. And I worked the last few years on the Measuring Effective Teaching project, and have done a lot of work on teachers and parallel work in healthcare, looking at performance and productivity differences across doctors and hospitals.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about whether you think these measures of teacher value added that we've been collecting are valid or perhaps biased against certain teachers depending on the different students that they have in their classrooms.
So I think there's growing evidence now that they're useful and on average valid and unbiased predictors of how teachers' impacts on state test scores. So I want to keep it narrow,
Okay.
right? And the evidence for that comes from both some randomizations like the MET study and also a well-known paper by Raj Chetty looking at when teachers move in and out of grades, what happens to average test scores of kids in the grades. And what these all suggest is that the kind of estimates of teacher impacts on state test scores that you get from virtually all reasonable value-added models do predict, on average, the kinds of effects that those teachers will have on students on their state test scores. I want to be, you can tell I'm being kind of a little careful, because it doesn't mean that for every teacher they're an accurate depiction of the impact they're going to have even on state test scores. So when we say here's a whole group of teachers who we think are going to increase test scores by 10 percentage points, on average those teachers will, but some teachers will do much better and some teachers worse. And so there's a spread within that group, but it's still useful information. It helps predict compared to other teachers, and it's really just about they are narrowly measures of state test impacts on state test scores.
That's right.
Now people have shown, like Raj Chetty has in his work, has this really nice evidence that those teachers who have big impacts on state test scores, their kids also do better on long-run life outcomes, teen pregnancy, crime, going to college, income, a range of measures. But that's not the only thing that teachers do. Like that, even in terms of teachers' impacts on kids' income later in life, the value added, the test score impacts, capture a small percentage of that. There's something else that we're not measuring with value added that people like to say, impacts on, I just call it non-test score outcomes. Sure. Economists like to call it non-cognitive, but that is, lots of things that aren't test scores are still cognitive. So anyway, so there's, I think, to me, what we've learned from the value added literature is we can measure teacher impacts on these things, and we should start thinking about impacts on other dimensions and start seeing if we can measure those as well.
One of the things that I've been wondering about in terms of this bias of the value added is schools seem to be going a little bit more towards interactive models. We know that teachers have coaches and other things. How does that sort of impact our ability to assess effective teaching when there is sort of this interaction model going on in schools?
So it's not a teacher, there's an entire system there within. Yeah, and I think that's right. Like, there's going to be things that are not just about the individual. A teacher in a different system may be a much better teacher because they'll be developed better. And there's a lot of interest, I think, in using value-added measures to learn about how that's done. So, will the name come to me? Matt Kraft and John Pape have this paper on how in schools where with good management practices, teachers show stronger growth in value added with experience. And so there's a lot of ways that we might start thinking about how do we develop better teachers, and so it's not just the teacher, it's the system they're working within. It doesn't make the teacher value added less useful. It makes you interpret it a little differently and think about other things you might be looking at beyond the teacher.
And so how does that relate to doing within and between school value-added measures? What do we know about being able to compare teachers that are teaching in very different settings?
Yeah. So within school, most of the evidence, not all, but most of the evidence that we have is looking at comparing teachers within a school, within the setting. probably the best evidence to date on what happens when teachers go to a different setting is Bo Jackson has a paper where he's basically finding that a teacher who's good in one school on average is good, but not as good as you might think when they move to a very different setting, to a different school. I think there's a lot of work still to be done there, including like the Raj Chetty paper is using new teachers moving into fourth grade, for example. And there's an interesting question if that's a teacher from we've always seen them performing in a very similar kind of school or the same school versus if they're coming from a very different. Do you see something different? So how important is the school context?
Yeah, so we want to sort of have a generalizable inference about teacher quality, but if they're going to be moving from a setting that's looks very different, we may not know much about what they'll do in that new setting.
Yeah, and I think at least the evidence so far suggests we know something, but less than we would have thought if they stay within the same setting. So there's some ability for a teacher to perform better than we'd expect when they go to a different setting.
Okay.
The other part of this that is floating around is you'll often hear people talk about high poverty schools have lower value added teachers. And there's a question about, is that the school? Or the teacher? Does the school make any teacher perform less well because of the challenges in that school or the lack of support or whatever? Or is it that school just ends up getting weak teachers and we could solve the problem by giving them better teachers? That's a big open question that we don't know the answer to because we haven't seen a lot of evidence that takes teachers from very good schools and puts them in not good, very wealthy schools and puts them in poverty schools or vice versa.
Sure.
We've seen a little bit, like there was a Mathematica study that just came out, but I think that's an area of real interest.
Definitely. Yeah. How should we be using value-added measures in practice?
So I think, the worst case for value-added measures is when they're used incredibly formulaically and purely kind of to punish teachers.
Sure.
What I've been seeing is the best. Well, there's not a lot of evidence on this yet, but the most promising models are ones that use multiple measures, use them both, for everything, meaning you're using it to give teachers feedback to help them improve. You're supporting teachers in doing that. You're using it too when teachers don't improve to have them do something else, right? To not give tenure. Because if you don't do that, you undermine, the belief of everyone that this matters, right? This is our mission.
Right.
We're doing everything we can, and if you can't do this, you gotta leave, right? You reward the best teachers with, both with pay, but with status and with, giving them more responsibilities and things, you want to basically say this is important. And so to me, and you don't get stuck in this is the only way we measure it. If there are lots of other ways we might measure teacher performance, and this system should be evolving. This is, teacher effectiveness 1.0,
Sure.
and we don't want to lock it in. We want, and so to me that's the best way. Which notice I just said everything.
Yeah.
But I think everything is really better than the state systems that are basically saying here's a formula and the only thing we use it for is to fire bad teachers. Well, that's not going to build a culture where people think you really care about improving. You gotta, if that's what you care about, you gotta support teachers to get better. You gotta give them feedback about how to improve, etc.
And like we were talking about earlier, we may be able to use these measures to form better student-teacher assignments. So using more information in terms of placing teachers with the kids that they're most effective with and the subjects they're most effective with.
Right, I think if schools, I do this in healthcare, and I work with a lot of networks of physicians who use these kind of measures all the time. And as they build trust and begin to realize this isn't, we aren't just out to get you. The whole goal is to make better decisions and improve outcomes for them, for the patients, for us, for the students. Everything should be pointing in that direction. That's how you build trust. So we're going to do student assignments. So we're not just going to get rid of you. We're going to say, let's try you someplace else where we think it'll be better. And that's kind of certainly the management goal.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you, Doug.